First of all, thank you, John. He made me realize a couple things. One is I had forgotten the Barney example. But it brought back, the reason it brought back a memory is Callista now writes children's history books in which Ellis the elephant teaches 4 to 8-year-olds American history. And we actually have an Ellis the elephant costume. It's too small for John. But we have a guy who's sort of this cycle's version of John who runs around wearing Ellis the elephant. And I never thought about how it felt from the inside. So that was, what he didn't tell you was the greatest impact I had in his life, which was he stayed around for free for a while. He finally got hired. He was working as an assistant in the Speaker's office. And I was running late, and so for 40 minutes, he had to entertain Miss America, who was the first person who had a disability. You may remember Heather Whitestone from Alabama. And at the end of 40 minutes, she was so grateful to see me that she married him. And they've had a wonderful family, and they live down on Sea Island in Georgia. And they're great. So I really feel that was a far bigger contribution than the Barney costume. But I'm glad to be here. This is obviously a very smart group, so I'm going to give you a sketch and then toss it open for Q&A. And I was asked to talk about the presidential election, so I will. I want to put it in context for me. I think this is an election which rivals 1828 with Jackson, or 1860 with Lincoln, or the 1896 between McKinley and Bryan, or 1912 where you had a three-way race between the incumbent President Taft, the former President Theodore Roosevelt, and Woodrow Wilson. And I say that because I think we have no idea today how this is going to come out. Hillary's ahead this week. She was behind 2 weeks ago. She has a perennial capacity to get behind again. Trump is currently finished a 10-day period of not being very competent. He also, though, has proven, again, before you get done underestimating him, he beat 16 people. He beat a Jeb Bush who spent over $100 million. 4 of the candidates he beat spent more than he did. So when the news media says, oh, and by the way, last month he raised $80 million. And so this is a very formidable person who is totally outside the norm. And therefore, he's very jarring at times, and the media hates him. And so you should just assume there will be an unending 3-month period of assaulting him. And the question is, can he adjust to it and figure out, the media is not the referees. The media is the offensive line of the left. And as a conservative, you got to get up every morning and understand whatever you do has to be designed to get past the offensive line to the American people. Because they will routinely lie about you, they'll routinely smear you, and they'll routinely cover you in ways that are grotesque. And so Reagan understood that. And so he very cheerfully reached pay. He never answered any of their questions. He said, I'm glad you answered that. You asked me that. And then he gave the answer he wanted to give in the first place. And he understood that they're not his friends, ever. Not for a single day in 8 years. And Trump's got to learn that. And it's hard to learn because he has this kind of naive belief that he got the nomination, now it's going to be a fair game, and he's going to be he versus Hillary, and it still stuns him how endlessly hostile they are. So we'll see. Whether he can learn or not, I don't know. It took Reagan 15 years to go from running for governor the first time to being president. That was a long learning curve. Trump's had 15 months. And is now, in a position where every mistake is magnified every day. So he has to learn very fast. I compared him the other day. There was a stretch where Joe Montana was throwing interceptions, and they just couldn't break out of it. And he and the head coach Bill Walsh got very hostile with each other. And Montana would go back out in the field and he'd be nervous and he'd throw another interception, and he'd come off and Walsh would scream at him for a while. And without using quite the language that Walsh used, finally. He went out and he threw a pass where there was not a single 49er anywhere close to the defensive receiver, who, of course, intercepted the ball. And he walks off, and Walsh says, do you know what that was? And he says, yeah, it was an interception. And he said, yes, and a blanking good one, too. And at that point, the tension broke, and he went back to being, a most valuable player. But, I mean, we'll see whether or not Trump has that kind of an ability to rebound. But here's the context you should put this in. Let me start with one other thing, though. How many of you play Pokemon Go? 1, 2, 3. This is good. This is actually more than I thought we'd get. Okay. I just wanted to raise that as an example. Do you play? Does that young man play Pokemon Go? Huh? What? There you go. All right. See? So, just remember, the expert in the room is the person who actually knows something, which is why hierarchies don't function very well in technological change. So anyhow, I raised that just for a second. One of the books I recommend all of you read to understand what's happening is a book by Charlie Murray called Coming Apart. And it's particularly useful because Murray outlines at the beginning of the book the hypothesis that you now have an elite that's unlike anything we've ever had before. And it's essentially composed of zip codes in which they're in the top 5% of income and the top 5% of education, and that they all marry each other. And so the result is you end up with people who are less and less aware of the rest of the country and who actually regard the rest of the country as weird. And he goes through it in some detail, and it's really worth reading just the opening section to realize it's you. And then because it'll help you understand the Trump phenomenon. I mean, Trump is attracting everybody who knows they're not going to be in the 5% and who deeply resent it. Now, because of the Republican Party's traditional incompetence in reaching out to minorities, he doesn't reach everybody who's not in the 5%, or he'd win by 80%. But he increasingly will figure out how to break through, and that's one of the things the Democrats have to really worry about. I mean, there's no great happiness in the south side of Chicago when 3,400 people have been killed since Obama was sworn in. It's just nobody's ever told them they're allowed to think about voting for somebody other than the Democrats. And so it would not take many weeks of Trump campaigning in south side Chicago to begin to have a revolution that was really very different. So in that context, one other book I want to recommend to you is Daniel Silva's Black Widow. It is his 16th novel about an Israeli assassin named Gabriel Allon. And the reason I recommend it, I had just read the opening 3 or 4 chapters, which are about France, just before the attack in Nice by the Tunisian who had migrated to France. By the way, he is never described in the media. The fact is that there were 4,000 attacks on Jews in France last year. And Silva captures it in about 4 chapters on France. Then he takes you inside ISIS, and then he brings ISIS to the U.S. And I recommend it to you because it's the most accurate description of the near future I've read. And that's the other thing people got to understand. We're in a real war. This war is not going to go, and this is one of Hillary's problems. I mean, 2 ISIS attacks, and her campaign will be a shambles, no matter what Trump does. And things like $400 million in cash being delivered to the Iranians, to the average American, when you deliver cash, I mean, $400 million in cash is a lot of cash. And when you happen to deliver it on the same day the hostages are released, and you deliver it because the Iranians ask you to deliver it that day so they have something to show in Tehran, and then you tell us it wasn't a payoff? The average American just goes, well, that's stupid. I mean, do you really believe that? So you have foreign policy challenges that are unending, and then you have the economy. Gallup estimates that 25 million Americans have dropped out of the middle class in the last decade. Now, if you've dropped out of the middle class, do you think you're happy? Do you think you say, wow, this system sure works for me? And so you get 2 phenomena. You get Sanders and you get Trump. Now, let me put it in a global context. How many of you are aware that the Austrians are going to have their 2nd presidential election in October? There you go, all right, very sophisticated group. The Austrians held their 1st presidential election, which was really important because the runoff was between a very left-wing candidate who wanted all immigration and a very right-wing candidate who wanted no immigration. The 2 major parties came in 4th and 5th. The 3rd candidate was an independent businesswoman. The entire establishment worked overtime for the left-wing pro-immigration candidate, who won by 31,000 votes. And it was then thrown out by the Supreme Court because they estimated the establishment had stolen over 60,000 votes. And in the latest Gallup poll, the election's not till October, but in the latest Gallup poll, the right-wingers ahead 52-48. And 3 more attacks in Germany, my guess is he'll be ahead 55-45. So that's Austria. In Italy, Rome elected the first woman in the 2,800-year history of the city. She got 67% of the vote against the Italian Prime Minister's party. North of her in Turin, another woman won with 67% of the vote. They both represent the Five Star Movement, which is an anti-corruption party created by a comedian. Okay? And that party came in second in popular vote, not in seats because of gerrymandering, but came in second in popular vote in the last parliamentary election. So that's how irritated the Italians are, and that's going to get worse because of migration and the turmoil that's happening. Plus the economy in Europe is just decaying outside of Germany. Third, of course, you had Brexit, which all of you are aware of, and in which the entire British establishment said no, no, no. And in England and Wales, they were beaten badly. And the only reason it was close was because Scotland and Northern Ireland and Gibraltar voted in favor of staying in. But in England and Wales, they just got clobbered. They carried London and nothing else. Then you get Iceland, one of the great examples of the modern world. Panamanian law firm gets hacked into. Turns out the president of Iceland had taken, totally legally, taken money and put it outside the country during a financial crisis. The country reacted very angrily. And those of you who've been to Iceland know this is a tiny country. So if you have 600,000 angry Icelanders, there's no place to hide. So the president resigned. In the special election, it was on a Sunday about a month ago, a history teacher who'd never before run came in first and became president of Iceland. An independent businesswoman came in second. The highest ranked professional politician was a former prime minister who got 13% of the vote. Finally, in Brazil, where the Bernie Sanders National Oil Company has been involved in $40 billion in bribes. I mean, this is a number so large that one can't quite imagine how they were doing this. The prime minister, or the president, has been impeached. The person who replaced her is under criminal investigation. Yesterday, in preparation for the Olympics, they had a 74-mile traffic jam in Rio. 74 miles. This is not easy. Okay? With a $40 billion scandal, 74% of Brazilians believe there's widespread corruption. This is a Gallup number. My favorite title is I'm a senior scientist at Gallup. Other places you'd be a consultant, but Gallup's very elegant. And they do a world poll. So 74% of Brazilians in the middle of a $40 billion bribery scandal think there's widespread corruption. The number in the United States is 75. Americans have about the same sense of disgust with their government as Brazilians. So they just think the whole system's rigged, the whole system's corrupt. And that's why Trump beat everybody else, and that's why Trump will be dangerous up to Election Day. I mean, if this country suddenly gels, they will beat the establishment 60-40 or better, because they'll just say, that's it. We're not going to do it anymore. And so that's why this is a wild period. Now, I don't think Hillary can fix anything on her side. All she can do is pound on Trump. The weaknesses Hillary has are not fixable. So she has got to destroy Trump, because if he's still standing on Election Day, he'll win. And she knows that. And that's why you're seeing this all-out effort. And they're going to try to destroy him by Labor Day so that it can fix him and he's out of the race. And the problem they've got is we live in the age of the Kardashians. I mean, a long news cycle is 12 hours. So I don't care what kind of shape he's in next Tuesday, there's the week after. And it's just astonishing how, 60 days is a lifetime in the current culture. And so it's all going to be a function of what happens around the world. And I think that the world's going to remain a very dangerous place. So that is a sweeping overview. And I thought it would at least stimulate one or two questions. Your turn. Yes, sir.
Newt, I've always appreciated your sense of history, and you're quite knowledgeable, especially in American history. What are your thoughts about when Mr. Trump has recently begun to talk about the election itself being rigged?
Well, I think it's a genuine worry, and I think that they have to organize enough Republican lawyers to be able to monitor all the precincts. I mean, it's a huge, continuing, ongoing problem, and always has been. I mean, there's no question in my mind. Nixon, for example, lost in 1960 because basically Illinois and Texas were stolen. I mean, period. So I think you always have to be aware of that possibility. And this is going to be a year where the machines are going to go crazy because, I mean, Trump represents the end of their world. Well, they're not going to say, oh, let's have a fair fight. They're going to say, I'm throwing the kitchen sink. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure we win. And this is a very old American tradition. In 1928, Franklin Delano Roosevelt runs for governor, and the Republicans upstate were holding some ballots out to see how big the margin had to be. And Flynn, who was the boss of Brooklyn, reassured him and said, don't worry about it. I'm holding out more precincts than they're holding out. And by the time when they come in, we'll come in, and you'll win. And it was just straight out theft. But you had to get close enough to steal. You can't steal if you're behind 25 points, so you've got to be within 2 or 3 points. But it's a serious problem in American politics. Yes, sir.
At what point in this election does Donald Trump have to start talking about his specific plans on immigration, on trade policy, on our national security issues around ISIS and other threats that we face? And does he have to talk about it? And if he doesn't, how much does it hurt him in this election?
Well, I mean, one of the challenges you have in the current American news media is if you give a serious speech in which you outline a serious plan, they don't cover it. Okay, so Trump gave a fairly serious foreign policy speech, which got one day of coverage, and then people said, why doesn't he talk about foreign policy? He gave a very effective APAC speech on the Middle East and Israel. Doesn't really count. I mean, so you can go through, he's given 6 or 7 pretty serious speeches, none of which get as much attention as whether or not he was impolite to a baby, which was one of the big news stories, I think, from yesterday or the day before. Because the media is, and it's not just Trump, I mean, the media's passion for trivialization is beyond imagining. I mean, if it's not simple-minded, if it's not small, if it's not personal, why are we covering it?
And just a follow-up question on that. He is pretty effective at getting his message through. Does he need then to change the way he's communicating his plans? Because most people believe that he's not describing specifics on his plans.
Right.
The media is not covering it, but instead it changes tack then.
First of all, I think he does have to do more specifics, and he ought to have a series of speeches that do that. I think he ought to also emphasize those speeches, but he only needs 5 or 6 big thematics. I mean, and then you have, and again, this is a guy who started his campaign saying he'd build a wall, and he was very tough on immigration. He then said he'd be very tough on trade. I mean, it's not like these are non-issues. And he's very clear that he would be much more cautious about sending American forces around the world. I mean, I think that's and it's part of what shakes up the Republican establishment, which after all sent a lot of people around the world. And so he is in a sense arguing not just with the Democrats, but he's arguing with the traditional Republican foreign policy establishment, which was part of what you're seeing in the kind of turmoil. And he's been fairly clear about that. I mean, if you actually go through and look at what he said, he has been more substantively different on national security and foreign policy than any candidate I can remember in at least 30 years. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the differences in his views with the Republican Party on trade, but really on immigration, on a whole bunch of fronts, including national security. Any concerns with what he's doing to the Republican Party? Paul Ryan came out against Paul Ryan this week, against John McCain. What are your thoughts on what's happening for the party at large?
Well, I mean, I thought what he said about McCain and Ryan was very foolish. First of all, because and I've said this to him personally, he's only got 2 targets. Barack Obama, because he has to win the argument over the last 8 years, and Hillary Clinton, because he has to win an argument over the next 4 years. Any time he spends talking about anything but those 2 is what I think of as an interception. I mean, it's walking out on the field and saying, let me give the ball to the other team. So picking a fight with Paul Ryan or John McCain was nonsense. And I've said that directly to him. This is nonsense. You know, and the question in my mind is, can he mature from being a very gifted amateur to learning the traits of a solid professional, part of which is, you know, don't rush out there and throw interceptions. If he can't, he's not going to win. If he can, he'll be extraordinarily formidable. The first time he has a week without a major mistake, you watch how fast he starts recovering. Because people in the end, you know, the vast majority of people in the middle don't want to be for Hillary. But they currently are being told you have to be for Hillary because, after all, look at the alternative. You know. Yes, ma'am.
I guess I'm surprised that you're here today because the media that you've just spoken about said that you and Rudy Giuliani were part of an intervention team. What truth is there in that?
Well, I think you now have a good test case. Okay. I know this is just evidence based on your own eyes. But we may call you in as a character witness.
Well, since you look just like my husband, it's going to be hard to know which.
But there are two of us here today, so you either have to assume your husband has been cloned, or I'm here and I'm not in some intervention. Look, I've talked very directly that he has got to get a grip on what he's doing. And I believe that, and I'm pretty happy. They're probably mildly irritated with me right now, but that's all right. No, I talked to all of them. I talked to all of them, including him. But it's very hard, and it's hard in part. You all can understand this because most of you are very successful. You wouldn't be here. This guy is 70 years old. He's made a lot of money. He's been very successful at things people said he couldn't do. He carried 37 primaries and got the largest Republican vote in history against a field of 16. You know, and so you walk in and you say, let me tell you what I'm worried about. And he's going, okay, I mean, which thing have you done? You know, and so there's an instinct inside him that says, wait a second, I got here being me. And even if I make mistakes and I stumble, you know, I'll recover and I'll get back up and I'll keep being me. And that's a fairly hard thing to change at this point. And I think reality is gradually having an effect on him. But I think all of you can appreciate it's very tricky if everything you've done that makes you successful suddenly doesn't fit the new situation. That's really challenging to figure out. Okay, how much of that can I give up and still be effective? I mean, and that's a deep part of him. Yes, sir.
Do you think that he would have won the nomination if it had been a field of 4 versus 16?
Yes. I think he'd won the nomination. In this particular year, he would have beaten anybody. And he would have beaten anybody for a very simple reason. On the Republican side, this is not true for Democrats. On the Republican side, and with a large number of independents, there is a desperate belief that the system is corrupt, it is sick, and it cannot be managed. And therefore, they want somebody who'll kick over the table. And so really smart people would show up. I mean, Jeb Bush is a great guy. He's a very, very good governor of Florida. I'm very fond of John Kasich, without whom we would not have balanced the budget. But they would show up and they would audition and they would say to the audience, I've really been involved in government. And the audience would say, that's it, go on, next person. You couldn't buy enough ads to overcome that reality. Meanwhile, the one guy who almost got it was Ted Cruz. And Ted Cruz would come in, he's very articulate, he was a Princeton debater, Harvard Law, you know, very smart guy. And Ted would give you a speech on the necessity of learning how to kick over the table and why he'd behaved in the Senate like somebody who would work to kick over the table. And he'd be halfway through the speech and you'd be enthralled and you'd think, wow, this is really interesting. And Trump would walk in the room, he'd kick over one of the tables. And they'd say, oh, we're for the real one. And so that, and then you'd run an ad and you'd say, do you realize Donald Trump did something bad? And they'd say, yes, and he'll kick over the table. And I don't care what you tell me about him, he'll kick over the table. And that's why the base of his vote, which is high school educated white males, who are the most dispossessed people in the country today. I feel like they're losing the most. You can argue that urban blacks are actually worse off, but white males right now in that particular cluster feel the most deprived. And they will probably never leave him. because he feels like them. It's also why his style is what it is. This is a guy who spent his life with construction workers. And he learned to talk at a 4th grade level because it works. He also learned to be very direct. So if you go, and there's a great movie about Mark, my mind's going blank. I think it's called, I won't get it right. Anyway, it's about the guy who tries out for the Philadelphia Eagles and makes the team. And if you watch the opening 20 or 12, Invincible, right. So in the opening 20 or 25 minutes of it, there are several scenes in South Philadelphia bars. And you see the Trump model. You know, Joey comes in wearing a yellow sweater. One of the guys goes, Joey, your girlfriend gets you to wear that? Everybody else in the room suddenly accused, we're going to pick on Joey tonight. And so they all gang on Joey. And it's exactly the Trump debate model. You know, I mean, you got to pick a name for somebody. You got to drive the name home. Low energy. I don't know why he's got such low energy. I'm really worried about how low his energy is. Have you noticed how low his energy is? They had Jeb Bush jogging in New Hampshire to prove. I mean, talk about getting inside somebody's head. You know, and I was asked at one point by Bill O'Reilly. He said, "Why do these guys not counterattack?" And I said, Bill, you have to understand that Donald Trump is the grizzly bear in The Revenant. If you wake him up, he walks over, bites your face off, sits on you for a while, and then goes off to go to sleep. And all the other candidates look at it and go, not me, I'm not going to touch this. And they just hope the bear will go find somebody else for a while. I mean, so that's what it is. Yes, ma'am.
I could not agree with you more about the anti-establishment fervor that Donald Trump is brilliantly getting swept up in. But how is he able to, with his avoiding his releasing his tax returns, how does he think intelligent Americans don't think there's something really bad in there? And there's what do you believe the truth is to connections he has with Russian oligarchs and Paul Manafort's connections to Ukraine oligarchs or Russian oligarchs controlling Ukraine and that sort of thing? Because I think the white educated, high school educated male might be concerned about that.
Well, first of all, I doubt if they'd ever believe it. Look, let me give you an answer that probably won't satisfy you. The morning Hillary wants to release the 33,000 emails she deleted, we can talk about it. I mean, she's not in a position to make a clear case. If only we had transparency. That'd be like saying, what if we knew everything about the amount of money given by Russians to the Clinton Foundation? That'd be, which was in the Wall Street Journal this week, or various dictatorships, or the Saudis. I mean, so you get into this fight, and what's happened is each side's partisans look at the other side. So if you're for Hillary, you go, why won't he release his tax return? And if you're a Republican, you go, why won't she do X, Y, and Z? But there's no middle ground left in America. So there's not a big market that cares, that's going to switch its votes. And I think Trump's attitude is, given the hostility of the news media, and just think about it yourselves. I mean, if he had the most pristine records possible, how hard would it be to make 60 stories out of the returns that are that complicated, partnerships that are that complicated, tax breaks that are that, I mean, everything that's totally legal, but when you put it up by itself, you could do one a day from now to election. And I think his attitude is just take the beating and keep moving, and that it won't resonate with most people he's trying to get votes from. Yes, sir.
What does Trump plan to broaden his base of voters, and do you think he can do it?
I think he does plan to broaden his base of voters because he's essentially a consumer-oriented businessman. Remember, all of his successes involve marketing. Whether it's his hotels, it's his golf courses, it's his condominiums, it's his ties, it's The Apprentice, which was the #1 show in the country, it's Miss Universe. I mean, all of these things involve consumer marketing. Well, so they have a pretty good notion that they have a problem. They don't necessarily have a solution yet, and they get distracted enough by these mistakes that it's hard to focus them. But I do think that they have a very clear sense that he has to have an ability to appeal to a lot of people who don't normally vote Republican. And I think he's going to be very aggressive trying to do it. Yes, sir.
So if he does win, what kind of president do you think he'll make? And will he be able to get along with Congress, for example?
I think actually, if you read The Art of the Deal and The Art of the Comeback, which are the two best books by Trump, my guess is, and this will make some Republicans nervous, my guess is that he's going to deal with Democrats and Republicans, and that the day after he wins, if he does win, he's going to pick up the phone and say, I want to work with all of you, and I understand under the Constitution we got to get things done together. So tell me what you need to vote yes on what I need, and let's talk. And that's my guess. We'll find out. I mean, he has historically been very good at remember, almost all the stuff he does, you've got to have city council, state legislature, planning commissions. I mean, the number of governments he's had to work with. So it's not like he's naive about this. He's pretty used to the idea of somehow interacting to get what you need to get done. Yes, sir.
Can you give us some insight into the logic behind his VP pick, Mike Pence?
What?
Some insight into the VP pick, Mike Pence, and what the logic behind it for choosing.
Vice President.
Yeah, I think the logic behind it in the end was that Trump was very enamored of the Indiana economic growth and thinks it gives him a talking point to say, gee, if the whole country grew as fast as Indiana, look how many more jobs we'd have. And I think he thinks in the end that the economic issue, particularly if the economy slows measurably in the next 60 days, Hillary has an enormous burden to deal with. And so a big part of this is going to be, do you think we got enough jobs and you got enough take-home pay? You ought to vote for Hillary. It's very simple. And he thought that Pence would be able to make that case based on that. They have a very big bias towards competing in the Midwest, if you count Pennsylvania as Midwestern. So Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin become a big piece of how they want to go, and they think that Pence goes over well there. And I can tell you that the governor of Iowa told me the night Pence gave his acceptance speech, he thought Pence would be hugely helpful in Iowa. That his style and his whole approach is very comfortable in an Iowa kind of competitive environment. So I think that was their reasoning. I spent about 2.5 hours with Donald the day before he made the choice, because obviously, based on news accounts, I was theoretically one of the possibilities. And I finally said to him, look, if you pick me, you're going to have a two-pirate ticket. We're both noisy, we're both aggressive, we're both willing to take on the media, and two pirates may be a little bit much. But if you pick Pence, you got a pirate and a normal person. And it may be a lot easier for the House Republicans, for example, and the governors to deal with Pence than it would be to deal with me. And I think that was a big part of the consideration, that Pence gives him a stability that's very helpful. He says the wrong thing about Ryan. 24 hours later, Pence is endorsing Ryan. I mean, and Pence and Ryan are very close, which is why Ryan introduced him at the convention. So I think it's a reasonably good choice. Yes, ma'am.
It's all well and good to laugh about Donald Trump, but if you just take it down to character, you said that he wrote Art of the Deal. He didn't write Art of the Deal. Tony Schwartzworth wrote Art of the Deal. And if you read any article about Donald Trump and his past history, he hasn't done what he said he's done. He doesn't have the billions that he said he's had. He has a disgraceful record in his personal life. We really want that kind of person as the head of the United States? The Republican Party should be ashamed of themselves.
That was a very nice speech. So let me pick up what you just said. So you think Bill Clinton is a greater paragon of virtue? You think the Clinton Foundation is right? Okay, right. Okay, he's not up for the vote. Let me put it differently. You think the Clinton Foundation, the amount of money it took from Saudi Arabia, the amount of money it took from Russians, the amount of money it took from arms dealers in Africa, you think that's more savory?
Highly dubious, but...
Which has highly dubious?
The Clinton Foundation, highly dubious.
Right.
I can see that, but I still resonate.
No, look, I think you have a race between the two least plausible presidential nominees of modern times. The only person who keeps Trump in the race is Hillary, and the only person who keeps Hillary in the race is Trump. Against any normal, competent, rational person, either one of them would lose. But But this was not a year when a normal, competent, rational person was going to be nominated by either party. Hillary, by brute force and sheer persistence, dominates the Democratic Party. Donald Trump represents the sheer anger of a very large number of Americans. And that's how you ended up with this particular set of choices, which I think are very problematic for the country and will pose substantial challenges for how we live out the next 8 years. Yes, sir.
What type of Supreme Court justice do you think he would appoint if he is elected?
Very conservative.
And would you take the position?
I'm not a lawyer. And have no interest in being on the Supreme Court. But, he's already, there's an example of being specific. He's already released a list. Everybody agrees it's a very good list. He's already described the characteristics. He has already said that the kind of lawyer that he would really like to have on the Supreme Court is like Scalia. Now, if you're liberal, that's a horrifying thought. But it's a pretty good appeal to conservatives, and the list was generally considered to be an absolutely first-class list. Interestingly, in terms of the Charles Murray model, it had less Ivy League than any list in modern times, and had more people who had gone to places like the University of Nebraska Law School or the University of Michigan Law School. So it would be, in geography, a much more diverse list than you would normally have expected. Way over there, and I'll come to you.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on what's happening to the Republican Party. I've read a lot about how there are concerns that the base conservative nature of the Republican Party is now moving left. And do you see maybe a paradigm shift in, after this election, Trump win or lose, the Republican Party being completely different in terms of its conservative values?
Well, I don't think it's completely different. I mean, we have, I always remind people when I'm told how much trouble we're in. We have the largest number of state legislators in the history of the Republican Party. There are more state legislators today who are Republican than any time in the history of the party, going back to 1854. We have 30 governors. We currently control the Senate by a narrow margin, and we control the House by a big enough margin that we're going to keep the House probably into the next decade. So I look at that and say, but we have a problem, which we don't have the presidency. But you get below the presidency, we are a very competitive party. And what you find is we're increasingly diverse. For the first time since 1920, we control the West Virginia State House. The margin of difference is an African-American woman who ran as a Republican. We currently are recruiting and attracting Asian Americans in California, and they're winning marginal districts away from Democrats because they can mobilize their entire community. So if you go around the country, you see a lot of people doing a lot. We did a report for the Republican National Committee, which you can get at Gingrich Productions, that laid out the results of 2014 and 15. So I would say to you that we're going to become a more modern party. And if you looked at someone like Casey actually governed pretty conservatively, but he was very problem solving. So he carried, I think, all but 2 counties in re-election, and he got 26% of the black vote. Black Lives Matter in Cleveland just endorsed Rob Portman. And Portman's made huge penetration because he is really focused on the opioid crisis, and that cuts across all party lines. I mean, so lots of different people who don't normally think of themselves as Republican like Rob Portman, because he's showing leadership on a topic that's very personal and very real and very human. So I think you'll see us be much more of a broader party in that sense and a less ideological party. But still probably broadly, we will be the conservative party in the country, particularly as they run to the left and are now about where the British Labour Party is.
In
Yes,
the
ma'am.
essence of time, 2 more questions.
All right, and you get to be one of them.
So interestingly enough, this leads very well into my question. So it's kind of 2 parts. So the first is the Supreme Court decision was recently reversed around voting and I can't think of the word, and you're going to know the title because you have more degrees than I do. And so what I'm actually wanting to ask is, in previous elections, the top of the ticket brought everybody along with them. You sort of drafted along along party lines. Is your sense that that's going to continue? And I'll leave it there.
Well, no, actually, that's unfortunately from our side not the way it worked. I kept trying to build a House majority. Nixon carried all but 2 states, and the Democrats stayed in control of both the House and Senate. Reagan carried all but 1 state, and the Democrats stayed in control of the House. Because, and you'll see this happen this fall, if in fact Trump doesn't get his act together, around September 10th, you'll see Republicans basically campaigning on the grounds you don't want to give Hillary a blank check. And we'll keep the House and probably keep the Senate. So sometime in early September, people have to make decisions for the last, for the final 6 or 8 weeks. And so they'll, Trump's got from now to about September 10th to prove that in fact our primary goal should be to elect him. But you can design a campaign to keep the Senate and keep the House that basically says, do you really want Hillary to have a blank check? And it turns out, as we discovered in '84, when Reagan won a huge victory, we thought we were going to gain a lot of seats. And at the margin, we kept losing seats because people would say, no, I'm not going to give him control of the Congress and the presidency.
Don't you think more people are going to be able to vote now, or they're going to feel more comfortable voting because some of the voter intimidation is going to...
There's actually no real evidence of that.
Oh, there's so much evidence of it. I mean, that's why if you look at the
So you think it's intimidating to be asked to prove that you're an American citizen to vote? No, I just want to know.
It's intimidating to be asked to show up at the police headquarters yes, that's intimidating for some people. There's a demographic that's very intimidating.
To be asked to show up at the police headquarters?
Yeah.
Where in America do we vote at police headquarters?
Well, that was the example actually that the justices used, where people were being asked to show up at headquarters because the initial place that they were going to have voting was actually shut down, and they were asked to go to headquarters. There was I believe there was an intimidation factor, and they moved it to something else, a school. So
And
there's
then
actually a specific example from the.
Okay. Well, you know more about the case than I do, despite the difference in our degrees.
Last question.
This has been a very interesting discussion, but what I want to know is, you've got very powerful family offices here. What can we do to help you to get Trump to listen? Let's solve problems rather than talk about nonsense.
Well, I mean, those of you who know him, call him. It's a very
you're a good guy. You know what you're doing.
Yeah, but it's a very straightforward process. I mean, if he hears from enough people, he hears from enough people. Those of you who care about that, I mean, then again, those of you who are for Hillary may want to call him and say, don't change. Thank you all very, very much.